Hello, geographers. We are back at it again tonight with our second lecture from the migration chapter. And tonight we're going to be looking at patterns regarding people's migration, where people are going, where people are coming from, and some of the reasons why that might be. So let's go ahead and dive right in with Ravenstein's laws of migration. Now, it's important to note that laws you see there are in quotation marks because these aren't laws like scientific laws where they've been tried and tested and proven over and over and over again. Instead, these are really more, like we just said a moment ago, patterns regarding migration. All right, and so let's take a look at it. Ravenstein, his name was E.G. Ernst George Ravenstein. He was a British sociologist as well as a geographer and cartographer, living in England, living in Britain, right around the time that Britain was going through stage 2 of the demographic transition model. So keep that in mind as something that might have influenced these laws of migration. So first law of migration is that most migrants will only go a short distance. This is typically going to be internal migration. It's a great example of distance decay. So not a bad thing to write down out to the side. And if we were doing this in a traditional classroom setting, I'd be asking you guys, okay, how many of you have moved before in your lifetimes? How many of you are not living in the house that you were born in? Not literally born in. The house that your parents brought you home to. Anyway, how many of you are living in a different house, have moved at some point in your life? Then I would ask, how many of you have moved from a different state? How many of you have moved from a different region of the country, like East Coast? How many of you have moved from a different country? And what do you think would happen in the number of hands that we would see as those distances tended to increase? And hopefully you'd say that the number of hands would decrease, the amount of interaction would decrease. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Second law of migration is that if people do go a long distance, they're more likely to travel to a big city. This is a great example of what we call the gravity model. And we'll talk about this here in just a minute, but the bigger a city is, the more name recognition that it will have, the more people that it will have, so more chances for things like chain migration to be taking place. New York City is a great example of that. Just incredibly diverse city. So many different areas like Little Italy, Chinatown, that are products of chain migration. And so people moving to those areas because family members have been there, because of the name recognition. So if they are traveling a far distance, much more likely to end up in a big city. Next one is that most migrations are going to proceed in a step-by-step nature. Just by definition, that is step migration. But it also ties into Lee's model of migration that we talked about in the last lecture. That they're going to be intervening obstacles, intervening opportunities, and things are going to come up. The next one is that most migration is going to typically be from rural to urban. We've seen this. Our planet is now a predominantly urban planet. We have more people living in cities than in rural areas out in the countryside, and that is a product of migration to a certain extent. It's not the only factor in that, but that's a contributing factor. Every migration flow produces a counterflow. So the example I will use is just to build on law number 4 that we mentioned above. Most migration is from rural to urban. So when those rural dwellers move to the city, do the people that were already in the city stay there, and did the city just get bigger and bigger and bigger and nobody ever leaves? Well, no. Those city dwellers are going to go, whoa, it's way too crowded now. And so I have to move out to the suburbs. So every migration flow, rural to urban, is going to produce a counterflow, urban to suburban. And so we're going to see that as a trend as well. Families are less likely to make international moves than young adults. I like to visualize this using the roots on a tree. The more roots that you have, the more challenging it is to uproot that tree or that plant. And so if you are a single young adult, you have fewer roots. And so it's easier to make a big move. It's easier to be uprooted than it is for someone that has a lot of family ties and things like that. And then finally, most international migrants are young males. So if you are going to make a big move, this is something that we can see represented in population pyramids. Remember, we looked at the population pyramid of the United Arab Emirates, how they had such a huge bubble on the male side right in the working ages. Well, this is a product of Ravenstein's law of migration, and so that's something that is a contributing factor here. Alrighty, now building on those laws of migration, we have to talk about a vocabulary term called migration selectivity, tendency for certain types of people to migrate. And again, this builds on what Ravenstein was saying, is that young people more likely to move than old people. Generally speaking, males are more likely to move than females, at least big international moves. Though that's why Ravenstein's laws are, air quotes, laws. They're not actually laws. Because even now, we're starting to see, especially here in the United States, about 40 to 60% of our international migrants are now women, joining family members that might have moved previously. And so we're starting to see some different things. And so migration selectivity is just the suggestion that we see certain patterns and trends, and that explains a lot of what this lecture tonight is going to be about. Most people migrate for economic reasons. Put a big gigantic star next to that. In terms of push and pull factors that we talked about last lecture, economic is the biggest push factor. Well, push or pull, doesn't really matter. It's the biggest reason why people will voluntarily migrate. And we mentioned that last unit. But this is the foundation upon which Ravenstein built his laws of migration, is that all these different things are based largely on economics. And so in terms of push and pull factors, if you are going to a new location because you're trying to find a new job or better wages, well, those are going to be pull factors, whereas escaping poverty is going to be a push factor, pushing you away. And remittances are another one of our definitions. We'll look at it in class tomorrow with our top 10. Money that migrants send back to family and friends in their home country, often in cash, forming an important part of the economy in many developing countries. So, in other words, in place of developing, what other terms could we use? Could we use MDC or LDC? What would we use? How about core, periphery, semi-periphery? What would we use? And so make sure that you remember those different terms. So now let's actually take a look at the gravity model, which was the basis for that second law of migration, that if people are going to move a long distance, like an international move, they're likely going to end up in a big city. So let's take a look at this. And the gravity model, by definition, so you're underlining important parts of the definition, here we go. A mathematical prediction of the interaction of places. The interaction being a function of population size of the respective places and the distance between them. Size, or population, is directly related to interaction, and distance is inversely related to interaction. So, a couple things that we need to know here. The two factors that determine interaction, which for right now will be migration, but it can be any kind of interaction. It could be the amount of travel back and forth between two places. It could be the amount of emails sent back and forth. It could be trade. Any of these things are forms of interaction. So keep that in mind. But the two basics that we need to know in order to calculate the amount of interaction there should be are population and distance. And so that's how this is calculated. So here is the formula. Population of place number 1 times the population of place number 2 divided by the distance between them squared. And this is actually built on, or the premise is based on Newton's law of gravity. The idea that the more mass that something has, the greater the pull that is going to have. So for us in the migration unit, and we'll talk about this in other units, so this is something that you want to put a star next to. This is something that we will be coming back to. The gravity model predicts interaction. In unit number 1, we said that as a function of distance decay, as distance increases, interaction decreases. This explains why. And so it allows us to reasonably predict the amount of interaction between two places. Now, here's the reality. You're never going to have to calculate this on the AP exam, or I highly doubt that you would. But if we were to calculate it, it gives us essentially what I call an interaction coefficient. It gives us a number, and the higher that number, the more interaction in theory there should be. So you get two very big cities like New York and Los Angeles, and despite the fact that they have a huge distance in between them, there's going to be a lot of interaction because there's a lot of people in both of those places. Which is why if someone is making a big move, an international move, they're moving a long distance, where are they likely to end up? In a big city. Why a big city? It has greater pull. That's what this is about. And so gravity model, in many of its different forms, can be used to predict the amount of interaction between the two places using just two pieces of information. And that is, again, population and distance. And so it gives us a way to predict interaction and predict patterns of interaction. So let's take a look at some of these different types of patterns that exist. So we have a couple different terms that we want to be familiar with. And this is going to move very, very fast. And so we just want to make sure that if you ever see these like in questions and things like that, you're familiar with these terms. So if we say intercontinental, it means from one continent to another. This was especially big like in the Cold War. There was a lot of talk about ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so there was a lot of concern about that during the Cold War. So intercontinental meant between one continent, from one continent to another, and during the Cold War it was between Asia, specifically the Soviet Union, and the United States and North America. So that's what we were talking about. Interregional means from one region of a country to another. Intra-regional, and this is important, within. So if you ever see intra, it means within. Inter, it means between, from one place to another. You're crossing some kind of border, whether it's a border between two regions, a border between two continents. International, between two national borders. Intranational, just like intra-regional, would be within. Intranational, within a country. Intra-regional, within a region. And then we also have rural to urban, which we know, according to Ravenstein, is one of the great migration flows that we will be talking about. So now we're looking at specifically internal migration, so within a country. And these are just our textbook definitions, so this should be fairly simple, but we're underlining important parts of the definition. So again, intra-regional, people moving within one geographic region within a country, so within a region. And then inter-regional, people moving from one region to another, again within a country. Now, if we wanted to stretch this a little bit and talk about more than just internal migrations, interregional could also be international if the overall culture is maintained. So now we start incorporating a little bit of culture and we start looking at, okay, if you are moving from Saudi Arabia to Jordan, that could technically be classified as an interregional migration. Moving from one region to another, in this case Saudi Arabia to Jordan, so long as the overall culture is maintained. Now, obviously, there's some differences because, there's a difference between someone who's a Saudi national versus a Jordanian national. But we could say that the overall culture is maintained. There's obviously some differences. But this is where this class, where you have to be a critical thinker to really help break this down. Because on the AP exam, and really in life in general, you're going to be faced with a lot of really complex thoughts and problems and situations. And you have to be able to say, okay, what do I know? Let me break it down with what I know. And then say, okay, this is how it fits. This is how it doesn't fit. What does that mean? And so you really have to be a critical thinker about a lot of these definitions. It's not just straight memorization. A lot of this is critical thinking. That's really going to help separate you. So try and find good examples, counter examples, ones that maybe you're not so sure about. So we'll take a look at those as we go. A couple more definitions for us that would fall into internal migrations, or in this case, intra-regional, so within a region. So a couple new definitions, as always, we're underlining. Urbanization, the movement of people to and clustering people in towns and cities. Net migration from rural area to the urban city area. So in this case, this is going to be rural to urban. Urbanization is rural to urban. And really, I think that's the association you need to make. So like on your vocab assignment, that's the association you need to make. Out to the side of this, yes, we're underlining important parts, but let's shorten it down. Rural to urban, that's what we mean when we say urbanization. Suburbanization is going to be movement of upper and middle class people from urban core areas to the surrounding outskirts to escape pollution as well as deteriorating social conditions, whether perceived or actual, and net migration from an urban area to the suburbs in more developed countries. And this is typically where we're going to see this, and I'm going to tell you guys right now that we could actually replace in more developed countries, because really, suburbanization is something that is unique to Anglo-America, the United States and Canada specifically. Because in many other parts of the world, even in other more developed countries, the suburbs are going to be areas that are lower income, and you're not going to see the upper and middle class people moving out to the suburbs. But we'll talk about that in unit number 7. And so I want to make that point that this definition really kind of fits with the example of suburbanization as we see it here in the United States. And again, to a certain extent, in a couple other places, Canada, to a certain extent as well, Japan. So there are some other examples where this fits, but it's really a definition that is more characteristic of the United States compared to, say, Europe. This definition would not work in Europe. And so again, in this case, shortening it down, urban to suburban. And this is that counterflow that Ravenstein was talking about earlier. People move from rural to urban. So what's going to happen? The upper middle class people are going to move from the urban areas out to the suburbs. Now, the last one is counter-urbanization, net migration from urban to rural areas. Now, what's kind of interesting about this, and we'll look at some examples in class of this, but again, this is that reaction. So people that had moved out to the suburbs before, and typically moving out there for peace and quiet, more open spaces, whatever it is. As more urban people move out to the suburbs, those people that had been out in the suburbs move further out into areas that are classified as, guessed it, rural. And so that's where this counter-urbanization starts to happen. Once again, this is that migration flow to counterflow. And again, we're not saying that mom and dad now that they've moved out to the rural areas are going to move back into the cities again. But what we might see is that the kids growing up in the rural areas are going to go, you know what? I want to be in the city. And so the cycle begins again. And so every migration flow produces a counterflow, and that's a really interesting law to look at in real life. So again, some real life examples of interregional migration. And again, we mentioned that interregional could be international if the overall culture is maintained. But these are just some that would classify as interregional between regions in a particular area. So you can see the one up top between the Northeast, South, Midwest, and the West here in the United States. Some examples of interregional migration in Europe and interregional migration between particularly into Southeast Asia, particularly from China. Now, we talked about this with our 8 great modern migrations. And this, the bottom right there, is a perfect example. This is the Chinese diaspora. This is that large-scale out-migration from China. That was one of the 8 great modern migrations that we talked about. And again, remember when we said great, we weren't necessarily saying good. We were just talking like huge amounts of people. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Huge amounts of people leaving China, going to other places like Southeast Asia, like the west coast of the United States and North America. And so this was known as the Chinese diaspora. And so you can really see it in that bottom right example. Now this brings in the migration transition model. And again, this coincides with the demographic transition model. This coincides with the epidemiological transition model. So as we're going through this, I want you to try and draw similarities, comparisons across these different models, because we're going to have to on the AP exam. So let's start thinking about that now. So here's our definition. Change in the migration pattern in a society that results from industrialization, population growth, and other social and economic changes that also produce the demographic transition. So remember, what major event moved those core countries from stage 1 to stage 2? Started the process of industrialization. That's right, the Industrial Revolution. So that same kind of thing started the migration transition model. And we talked a little about this in chapter 2, but now we're going to get into the details of this. Name that you absolutely need to associate with the migration transition model is Wilbur Zielinski. It's a name that you're going to need to know. And what Zielinski said is that in stage 1, people are moving for food rather than for permanent migration. Now, this could be nomadic hunter-gatherers. It doesn't necessarily have to be, though. Really, we're not going to see a lot of migration. It's not a lot of permanent moves. When you're talking about, city-states and things like that, a lot of what humans lived in for a long period of time, we didn't see a lot of population growth until, about 1800 when we hit 1 billion people globally. And so there wasn't a lot of need to move permanently. So you didn't see a lot of people making those moves. And even the people that did, it wasn't massive numbers. So stage 1 really isn't characterized by a lot of migration. Very little migration. More characterized by, moving around for food and things like that. But not permanent migration, not moving to a different city or country and things like that. Stage 2 is when things really take off. Because, remember, in stage 2 of the demographic transition model, what changes? What happens? Because in stage 2 in the migration transition model, due to a high population and high population growth, we see a lot of out-migration. People leaving. They're going elsewhere. So where are they going? Well, they're going to stage 3 and stage 4 countries. And there is a certain hierarchy to this, because the stage 2 countries, and remember stage 2 we largely associated with the periphery, are going to go to either semi-periphery or core countries. Stage 3 countries, which we largely said semi-periphery, are going to be making their way to the core. So then what about the core? Well, again, we mentioned these are the destination spots for the stage 2 migrants. But again, stage 2 might go to stage 3 or 4, but we're also going to see some migration from stage 3 into stage 4. If we go back and look from the very first lecture, that net migration chart map that we looked at, we saw a lot of out-migration from Mexico. Well, where's Mexico going? Mexico is coming into the United States. And historically, that is true. And we'll look at a contemporary example of that here in just a couple minutes. But keep in mind, Mexico is a stage 3 country. And so they're leaving to go to a stage 4 country. They're leaving a lot of people going to the core. Same thing with Eastern Europe. Largely, I would say, part of the semi-periphery, stage 3. Where are they going? To Western Europe, stage 4. Now, what about the migration in Stage 4 countries, like, are people moving? Yes. By stage 4, most of this migration is going to be internal, and it's going to largely be intra-regional, and typically it's going to be cities to suburbs. And again, where is that most likely to be taking place? The United States, right? So we're going to see the kind of the exact opposite in Europe, but we'll talk about that later this year. We're seeing people move from the suburbs towards the city center. We'll explain why that is in unit number 7, but all of this is going to be tied together. Everything in this class is just, everything is connected. So let's take a look at some global migration trends. And so we can introduce another vocabulary term. So we're underlining again, migration stream, a well-defined migration channel from a specific origin to a particular destination. So things that have been established. And there's 3 major ones that we should be familiar with. And this is right now. We've got Asia to Europe, Asia to North America, and Latin America to North America. And so we can actually see that on this chart. The larger the arrow, the more data is represented. So if we were to ask, what type of map would this be? And you would probably say, it's a graduated symbol map, because the size of the arrow denotes the amount of data that we see. So this is looking at annual net migration. And so we're seeing about 500,000 people annually coming from Asia to North America. About another 500,000 from Asia to Europe. And so that's what we're seeing. So generally here in calculating net migration, remember net migration is the difference between out-migration and in-migration, so emigration and immigration. So we have more people coming in, so more immigration in Europe, North America, and Oceania. Whereas we have more emigration people leaving Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So if I were to ask you guys, is this map a good indicator of development? The answer is absolutely yes, it is. So can we see this in a particular region over time? And the answer is absolutely yes, we can.